Hello and welcome to the latest instalment of the Nevin Economic Research Institute's discussion series. My name is Aoife Murphy and I'm joined today with Professor John Barry from the Queen's University Belfast. Today we'll be discussing issues around climate change and the just transition. So thanks very much for joining us today, John. It's great to have you.
Glad to be here, Aoife.
So I suppose I'll just start off quite broadly to begin with. So we've had a number of reports in the last few years detailing the issues that we face with climate change. And the most worrying of which, in my opinion, is the IPCC's latest report, which issued, a code red for humanity. So I suppose just given the colossal amount of work that's going to be involved in, mitigating these issues, why do you think we've been so slow to face up to the challenge of climate change?
Yes, I mean, you've picked up on a really important issue, is that, we could become the first species ever to accurately document our own demise. I mean, every year that goes by, the scientific evidence of us going in the wrong direction, whether it's on climate or ecological and biodiversity loss. And so there's a massive gap between what the science is telling us and what politicians, or indeed what populations, are willing to do in terms of the quite radical changes that are going to be needed across all sections and sectors of our lives, from how we heat, how we eat, how we transport ourselves, the jobs, our trade policies, investment, and so on. I mean, it's simply exciting in one respect in terms of the scale of the challenge, but also the urgency. So you've got issues of the scale. We're going to have to move at a big scale across many parts of our economy and society, but also the clock is ticking, and therefore we have to move with some urgency. And you can look for answers in a variety of people are scared. They are not willing to admit things are as bad as they are. There are clearly vested interests, whether it's the Irish Farmer Association in the south or the Ulster Farmers Union here in the north, that are resisting more ambitious climate action. The disgraceful but not completely surprising actions of fossil fuel companies over many years. The ways in which our politicians, are often attentive to the needs of business, such as farmers and fossil fuel companies, which then leads to fairly weak legislation. So it is this juncture between what the science is telling us, but also what politics is willing to countenance. And also, to put it in a rather provocative way, is that most politicians and policymakers, and indeed I think most citizens, find it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Nobody's really talking in any serious way that the root causes of the ecological and climate crisis lie in the structure of our economy. And it's not just about burning carbon. Carbon is a symptom. So therefore, we need to actually address the underlying political economy. And that's just too much for certainly most of our politicians. But also, I think there's still a journey that our citizens need to go on in terms of addressing those bigger issues about moving beyond or radically reforming capitalism as we currently know it.
Absolutely. And I think it was Audre Lorde who said, although it was in a completely different context to this now, but, this idea that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, So I suppose in this context, it was a neoliberal capitalist model that got us into the mess of global warming and climate change. It's likely not going to be a neoliberal model that's going to get us out of it again. But I suppose there you mentioned kind of issues around, we've kind of come to the acknowledgement now that it is an issue, but there's a lack of action. Is there any steps that we could maybe take to bridge the gap between discussing issues around climate change and actually taking steps to combat the issue?
Well, just in terms of trading good feminist quotes, I'll give you one from Gloria Steinman, who said that the truth may set you free, but not before it pisses you off. And in many respects, that's what the climate science is telling us. I mean, it's pretty stark in terms of the changes that are needed. And on the issue that you mentioned there, I think we've moved into a new phase, at least in mainstream political and media debates, where what I see is that we don't see high levels of climate denial as we did, say, maybe 10 years ago. But what we now see is lack of climate ambition and climate delay. So I'd say climate delay, that, we need less ambitious targets. We need to push decarbonisation out further down the line. That's the new climate denial. Buying more time, investing literally money and also people's hopes in my view, science fiction dreams of negative emissions technology, that somehow technology is going to solve this. And many people don't actually know that these international climate agreements, whether it's the Paris 2015 or indeed the more recent Glasgow Climate Pact from COP26, although I rather call it FLOP 26, given how disappointing it was, that if you actually look at the what's called integrated assessment models they use in terms of developing their policies and agreements, they assume as of yet invented technologies that is going to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. And to me, this is quite frightening, but also even more so that it's not more publicly debated, that we're basically betting on as yet invented technologies like carbon capture and sequestration in particular. And we have no proven at scale demonstration that these technologies are going to work. But again, I think we're in that stage where yet there's a kind of a rhetorical recognition that, yes, we are facing a planetary emergency, but any solutions must resolutely be within the confines of the existing economic paradigm. Because what really needs to be sustained is not a habitable planet, but capitalism. And that's, we're still back to that issue that we're not really getting to the root causes of these problems. But at least, there's, as I say, less climate denial, but there is high levels of technological optimism, which to me are forms of mythic thinking and very risky wish fulfillment, or this sense that climate delay is the strategy now. And I can give you some examples of how we have a good example here in the north in terms of 2 climate change bills going through the assembly, and one is more ambitious than the other, and explain some of the reasons behind that. So this is happening in real time now, this delay, because the reality is that the longer we delay, the more costly is going to be the transition. It's like that old saying that you fix the roof when it's sunny, you don't wait till it's raining. And so the longer we delay, the more it's going to cost, both in terms of blighted human lives around the planet as a result of climate breakdown, but actually in terms of capital and wealth and resources that we are now going to have to invest in repairing damaged ecosystems or paying for more costly decarbonization down the road rather than doing it now.
Absolutely. And I suppose the issue as well that kind of brings up with that as well, we're struggling at the moment to fund basic things like health, education and housing. How are we going to add all this extra cost onto it as well? But I suppose just turning to Ireland then more specifically, I know yourself and co-authors recently described Irish climate policy as a matter of doublespeak. I suppose just in the sense that, the government have taken these measures to reduce emissions, but at the same time, they're still allowing, private owned corporations and so on to continue engaging in pretty carbon intensive activity. So I suppose, do you think, are there any steps that could be taken to tackle this issue in itself? I know it's very systemic and structural, so there's probably no easy answer, but any suggestions at all?
Well, it is about calling out the hypocrisy, that doublespeak that you mentioned. And the Republic of Ireland is no different than most other countries around the world on this. I think with the exception maybe of Costa Rica or maybe Cuba to some extent, most countries are speaking with forked tongue. So the UK government, that was the presidency of the COP26 conference, want to be a climate leader. At the same time, it's proposing to build new airports. It's proposing a new coal mine in Cumbria. It's proposing to issue new gas and oil exploration licenses in the North Sea. And the science is pretty clear. We cannot invest in extracting any more hydrocarbons from the earth to burn for fuel. The Irish government, similarly, in terms of allowing liquefied natural gas plants to continue, the unabated expansion of electricity-hungry data centers that, according to some analysis, that by 2030, I forget the exact figure, somewhere between a quarter and a third of all Irish electricity, and I don't know what proportion of Irish water, will simply go to service data centers, most of which are not fueled by renewable energy and so on. So there's a kind of a lack of a systemic approach to the picky decarbonization, but also I think we also need to invest more money in climate adaptation. That it is inevitable, even if we were to stop burning fossil fuels and reduce the beef and dairy cow herd across the planet, because dairy cow and beef cows produce methane, which is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon, although it's less lasting, even if we were to do all of those things, because of the way the climate system works in terms of the lag. So we pump up greenhouse gas emissions now, but it's not for decades later that we experience the global warming as a result of that. That we're going to have to start investing in adaptation. Cities like, for example, Belfast or Dublin or London, New York, and so on, they're all very vulnerable to coastal storm surges, sea level rises. So what's the adaptation plan for a city like Dublin? What's going to have to change in our planning laws so that people are not having their houses flooded, as they often do in Britain and Ireland now on a fairly regular basis, as a result being built in floodplains? Are we investing in what's called nature-based solutions to grow more trees, to re-wet boglands, and sequester carbon naturally, as opposed to some of the batshit crazy technological solutions that I mentioned a moment ago? So while we must always try and focus on decarbonisation and climate mitigation, the reality is we also need to not take our eye off the ball of transformative adaptation. And the good thing about both of these strategies, just even in particular around climate adaptation, is there's jobs to be had. There is economic benefits in terms of these nature-based solutions. So it's not as if this is a sacrifice or that somehow this is taking away from people having decent jobs and good lives. Because what we're really talking about here, Aoife, just to finish, is this is a new green industrial revolution. There's a new model of how our economy is organized. And we're now at this stage of this interregnum between, the fight back by the existing carbon-based system, supported by politicians and particular political parties, and the emergence of this new green, sustainable and regenerative economy. But at the moment, what I see are the forces that want to have a green capitalism are much more powerful than those that want, some version beyond capitalism that's still low carbon. So what's on offer now is, do you want, fossil fuel capital or green capital? And I do think we need to work, particularly if you're on the left and progressive, in trying to open the door for a non-capitalist but green and regenerative economy.
Absolutely. And I suppose here at NERI, you're quite interested in the implementation of a just transition, in many sectors of the economy, as you're kind of mentioning there earlier. But I suppose, what would it look like really at a new, reinvented economy? Either here in the Republic of Ireland or in Northern Ireland, UK as well, and all these kind of neoliberal countries. It's kind of hard to imagine something that we've just been so used to and refuse to question on a daily basis.
No, it is that, we live in what the political theorist Mark Fisher called a capitalist realism, where it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism and so on. And many of us have lived in cultures and societies that have been so thoroughly neoliberal that that's all we know. We can't even think outside them. I think the first thing to say is that I don't think any green, regenerative, low carbon economy is going to look the same. I mean, that's one of the mistakes in a way of the neoliberal model. It's a one size fits all. Whereas I think, we're going to have to look at a more pluralistic view of what in each place, depending upon the assets, the natural assets in particular of a society, what a green and low carbon economy would look like. I'll give you some outlines. I mean, I should at some point write a version of Solzhenitsyn's A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. I should write A Day in the Life of a Green Economy. What happens when you wake up? What are you eating? How are you transporting yourself? I'll give you a flavor of what I think a green, low carbon, regenerative economy would look like. At a fairly high level, it's a movement away from what Naomi Klein, that many of our listeners may know, great Canadian activist and writer. She says our current system is a dig and gig economy. It's an extractivist, neo-colonial, imperialist, linear economy based on take, make, and throw away in an unsustainable manner. But the gig element is also important as well. The growth in precariousness, non-unionized, precariously paid workers is all part of the neoliberal landscape. And what we need to move from that dig and gig economy is the care and repair one, in terms of moving our economies towards more care for each other, particularly as our populations get older, but actually moving into the sphere of reproduction, in terms of, social reproduction, of caring for the old, the sick, and so on, outside the monetized economy. And also the care is about, caring for the planet in terms of repairing quite a lot of the degraded ecosystems. So for me, what that would look like is, on the one hand, we're going to have to see much more government investment in natural capital, re-wetting boglands, growing more trees, these nature-based solutions, from an orthodox neoliberal or capitalist economic perspective, it's unproductive. It's not going to return any profit, but these are necessary to sustain the life-supporting systems of the planet. So we're going to have to need infrastructural investment in those green capital spaces. I think we're also going to move away from an individualized consumption model to what I would call socialized consumption. So rather than saying that our transportation needs has to be met by either an internal combustion engine car or an electric car, it is about, what about walking, cycling, public transportation, and so on. What about libraries as opposed to the kind of experience we have now of having this individualized consumer experience? Laundromats, light rail, and libraries is one way of encapsulating this. Free festivals for people as ways of enjoying, a decent life. So these forms of what I would call socialized consumption, I do think are going to have to be part, in my view, of a green economy. I would also say we're looking at the 3-day working week. We're going to have to make the decision that any productivity increases through changes in work practices or technology is not going to be delivered in increasing output, but actually giving people more free time with no cut in wages. And we know the studies are there that a 3 or 4 day working week actually makes people more productive. But I think often we lose the ecological benefits of that when people are actually in production spheres that are producing more stuff that we actually don't need, and so on. So I do think we're going to have to look at ways in which we maximize meaningful free time as a public policy objective, and away from output and orthodox economic growth. Going more radically, perhaps, I'm not saying everybody will go with me on this journey, that to complement socializing consumption that I talked about there a moment ago, we need to recover, certainly on the left and in the trade union movement, about democratizing production. Talking about worker cooperatives, worker voice, workplace democracy, workers having more autonomy, control, and ownership over the means of production, particularly in the energy transition. Just to finish, I think that technologically, we have a greater capacity to democratize the energy means of production as we move away from centralized carbon or nuclear generated electricity plants, that it is technically feasible to have communities and workers owning and controlling renewable energy installations in a way that perhaps isn't possible with centralized fossil fuel or nuclear power plants. So for me, if you want a simple watchword, is socialized consumption, a 3-day working week, and democratizing of production.
Absolutely. And I suppose, are there any ways of ensuring, that the implementation of these, ideas, such as, for example, the 3-day working week and so on, don't maybe exacerbate existing inequalities, present in the system, people with, office jobs, third level education and so on, being the first to take these shorter working weeks, and, other people maybe happen to pick up the slack. Is there any way of, ensuring that kind of thing doesn't happen? Just as an example.
No, it's a really good question to ask, and always been aware of the either intended or unintended side effects of any policy that you implement. I mean, it shouldn't be the case that what you described has to be a necessary outcome, that it's only few privileged workers that can have this shorter working week and good work-life balance and a high quality of life. To me, that would be an example of an unjust transition, because it means then that members of our community and workers, some workers will not get the benefit of this transition. It will accrue only to perhaps a minority. And therefore, any policy has to be mindful, of making sure everybody benefits from this. And that may require compensating or counteracting policies. And also a consideration, are there certain spheres of production that we can't, have more democracy within them? For example, Or are there certain forms of production of goods and services that can't allow most of the workforce to go to a 3 or 4 day working week? In my view, other things being equal, I can't see why any sphere of production is not open to being democratized, or any sphere of production that isn't open to having its working week reduced, and so on. And to really answer that question, which has always been a curiosity for me, why is it that in the entire history of capitalism and industrialization, we've had the phenomenon of less people working more rather than more people working less? You know, that's the real issue for me, that whereas perhaps at a previous evolutionary stage, certainly in the West, the problem was lack of production, you know, lack of material goods and services to lift people out of poverty. I think we've now passed that point in most parts of certainly Europe. And our real challenge now is to have meaningful free time. And that, I think, means that effectively on a global scale, the global north needs to go on a carbon diet. I think we need to move into a post-growth, if not degrowth, position in terms of we have enough material goods and services. The problem is they're not distributed equally enough within our societies. But there's absolutely no way ecologically, on a biophysical basis, can the majority of the human family in the global south that are consuming less than they deserve, there's no way the planet can sustain the increase in productivity needed for them unless we in the over-consuming world actually reduce that our demands upon the planet. Now, for me, that global issue is a matter of global justice. It may not convince a lot of people unless you're already interested in the lives of those in the global south. But there are other reasons, some of which I've just outlined, that we'll have higher quality of lives, less stressful lives, if we translate productivity gains away from increased output and actually into working less.
Yeah. So I suppose that's really all the questions I have for the moment anyway. I don't know if you've got anything else to add for yourself or anything you'd like to suggest.
Well, more for maybe the education of listeners in the Republic and in terms of what's going on up here in the north on some of these issues. So we have the curious case of 2 climate bills going through the Northern Ireland Assembly. It's a bit like buses. None come along for years and then suddenly 2 pop up. So I'll briefly describe them because they really encapsulate the challenges around this transition between the forces of reaction and delay and less ambition, and then more progressive forms of policy and movement. So 2 years ago, Claire Bailey, the Green Party MLA, with the support of all the other parties in the Assembly, with the exception of the DUP, brought forward a private member's bill on a climate change bill that would commit Northern Ireland to net zero carbon by 2045. Edwin Poots, who is the DUP Minister for Agriculture and the Environment, didn't like that bill, so he proposed his own bill. And his bill is committing Northern Ireland to have a 2050 target and 82% reduction, so much less ambitious. And the main reason, and this will be familiar to listeners from the south, is that the agricultural lobby is very, very strong in the north as it is down south. And it was seen that the more ambitious climate change bill was, according to the Ulster Farmers Union, going to spell Armageddon for the farming community here. Cull in the beef and dairy herd. You know, we've had DUP politicians like Sammy Wilson say that the more ambitious climate bill would mean that we'd end up eating insects and locusts because we won't be able to grow enough food. As a result, a lot of really, nonsense, but nonsense that sticks in the media. And so we have this hiatus now whereby the less ambitious climate change bill, because it's being brought forward by a minister, is going to leapfrog over the more ambitious bill. And so there's a real danger because we have the Assembly going for an election in May and things are beginning to wind down, or the window for getting legislation through is closing, is that we could either have no climate change legislation at all because we just run out of road, which actually I think would suit the Ulster Farmers Union and indeed Edwin Poots and the DUP, and it could be that was the game plan all along. Second, and just as bad, is a really weak climate change bill that Edwin Poots has brought forward. Of course, there's always a possibility that the third option, which looks the more progressive or the more realistic progressive option, is that I think the Clare Bailey cross-party bill probably won't make it now in time. So the best that can be done is to try and influence the Edwin Poots bill with some of the more ambitious Clare Bailey bill. And that's what myself and others are involved in terms of a big rally up in Stormont next Tuesday, the 1st of February, which is St. Bridget's Day, which is the old ancient Irish tradition of Imbolc, the feast of the lactating ewes, which means that we're entering into spring. So the fight is still on, but I suppose the reason why I tell that story in terms of what's going on, it really brings out the terrain of struggle in climate change legislation. There's no reason in the world why farmers need to feel threatened by any climate change legislation, because much like the structure of farming down south, the ones who are making the most noise here in the north are big farmers, tied into large agri-industry and so on, not your small farmers. So the IFA and the UFU do not represent all farmers, and it's a real pity that farming has been, set against climate in this way. And so I'm pretty realistically hopeful that we may get some ambitious climate change legislation. But of course, that's only the start. I mean, there's much, much bigger changes that we need to engage in. And while legislation is important, it's not the be all and end all of the type of changes that we need to see right across society. So watch this space. It may be that in the next couple of months, Northern Ireland is not the only place in Europe, as it is at the moment, the only place in Europe that doesn't have any climate change legislation. The last thing I'd also say, Aoife, just in terms of leaving folk with something positive or something to consider, is the importance of developing a working class environmentalism. Before there, we were talking about how for many people, they can't think about the end of the world when they can't think about the end of the week in terms of struggling to meet bills and so on. Where's the jobs, the investment? How can this climate issue be connected to health and education and housing? And particularly on housing and on health, there are quite easy ways of connecting this. We know, because the epidemiological evidence is there, the more we take internal combustion engine cars off the road, the more we move away from a fossil fuel-based energy system, this improves people's quality of lives and air quality. I mean, a study that was done in Harvard there last year showed that for the figures they looked at and they could find in 2018, I mean, it's an amazing statistic. In 2018, a fifth of everybody who died on the planet died because of the burning of fossil fuels. Now, it was largely concentrated in the global south, but if you look at the study, there were also large pockets of incidents of mortality in North America and parts of Europe. So it wasn't just that it was all in the global south, but the majority of deaths from the burning of fossil fuels in the global south. So air quality and improvements in the quality of life is associated with removing ourselves from dependence upon fossil fuels. So it's a benefit, not just in terms of helping the climate, but actually it improves people's quality of life. The other one, and we have experience of this in Belfast because I co-chair the Belfast Climate Commission, has to do with housing. And I don't think what I'm going to tell you now is different than many other cities and perhaps housing developments across the island, but it's particularly acute in Belfast. We have a particular problem with fuel poverty. The best estimate we have is somewhere between 25 and a third of all households in Northern Ireland are in fuel poverty. That means they're spending more than 10% of their income just to stay at an ambient, comfortable temperature. And the main reasons for this is that we're unique in two respects. We have some of the worst insulated housing stock in Europe. And secondly, we depend upon oil for space heating, unlike gas in many other parts of Europe and the south and so on. And we did a study in Belfast about mapping out our roadmap to net zero by 2050. And what we found is that the single biggest cost-effective measure that also was the single biggest carbon effective measure was to retrofit houses in Belfast. Now, that to me is a multiple benefits. It will create jobs. It's going to have to pay people to retrofit houses. It would give people more money in their pockets that they can spend, so it increases their disposable income. It improves their quality of life, including their mental health and their, overall physical health as well. And as a Brucey bonus, it reduces our carbon emissions. So there's a quadruple benefit from retrofitting houses. And I think those type of policies are the ones that will get working class people on board with any climate mitigation and climate reduction plan. That will get people supportive, I think, of climate policies in a way that carbon taxes won't. And that, of course, is a big fear that we could see, particularly down south, if carbon taxes begin to really start impacting on people, particularly now as we speak, Aoife, energy prices are going through the roof. 30% increase here in the north in gas and so on. That, if we see carbon taxes increasing the misery of people as they're coming out of the pandemic, and particularly if the government engages in austerity, certainly as I think the UK government is planning to, we could see a kind of gilets jaunes type reaction that we've seen in France against the imposition in France of a carbon tax on diesel. So I think these are the types of policies we need to be looking at, are those that will reduce carbon, help us address the planetary crisis, but in ways that people can get real material, tangible benefits from. And that we move away from this idea of the green agenda as either the purview of the guilty, educated, urban middle classes, or indeed that the green agenda is one about sacrifice, it's what we're going to lose. Well, there's a policy, a very simple one of retrofitting houses that actually is probably the most effective climate policy we could certainly introduce here in the north. And I'm sure it's similar in many parts of the south as well.
Absolutely. Well, those issues around, energy, poverty and so on are really echoed here down in the south as well. And I suppose it's just this idea that these things are all viewed very separately: housing in one box, health in another box, education, and then the environment. And they're all, at the end of the day, intrinsically linked, and they need to be tackled in that way. But that's great. I suppose we'll just finish off there if you've nothing more to say, but thanks very much for coming on today. And I'm sure everyone listening will have loads to take from that.
That's great, Aoife. Thank you very much.
Thanks a million.